We're live.
Good evening. It's December the 20th at 7 o'clock, and welcome to this Cannabis Legalization Workgroup meeting. It's a virtual workgroup meeting. Please be patient if we encounter any technical or streaming issues. Before we begin, workgroup members should know this is being live streamed on the Maryland General Assembly's YouTube channel. Workgroup members will be muted during the briefing, and if you have a question, please use the raise your hand function within your Zoom window. I appreciate it that everybody's making time for this tonight. In this meeting, we're going to hear from several guests who are joining us from the National Safety Council, which is a not-for-profit advocacy organization that focuses on impairment, roadway, and workplace safety. Throughout this entire process, all of us here have given thoughts and raised concerns about how legalizing recreational cannabis will impact employees in the workplace, how employers could enact or adjust policies when it comes to employment protections for off-duty cannabis use, and how government bodies could legislate laws to appropriately respond to and address this issue and any related concerns. So to help us better understand the national landscape of how cannabis legalization at the state level impacts workplace safety and policy, we'll hear from several guests from the National Safety Council: Jenny Burke, the Vice President of Impairment Practice; Jane Terry, the Vice President of Government Affairs; and Mr. David Medeiros, the President of the Chesapeake region of the National Safety Council. After our presentation, I'll open the floor to a question and answer session between the workgroup members and our guests. During this time, we'll be joined by two additional guests from the National Safety Council. We'll be joined by Katie Mueller, the Senior Program Manager at NSC, and Michelle Gaida, the Government Affairs Manager at the NSC. Before we begin, though, very quickly, we will meet again on January 5th, Thursday, January 5th at 1 p.m. Notice is going to be sent to your offices to ensure the meeting is added to your calendars, and further agenda details will be shared and publicized on the Maryland General Assembly website when those are finished. With that, who would like to go first? Ms. Burke, Ms. Terry.
Hi, Chair. Yes, Jane Terry from the National Safety Council. And actually, Jenny Burke is not able to join us tonight. She's already taken some time off to be with family.
Okay.
But thank you for having us. Just real quickly, I'll call out a couple of people from NSC. And then once our friends at the Chesapeake chapter begin, I'll let Dave introduce those folks. So as you mentioned, we've got Katie Mueller, who'll be speaking a little bit later. Also, Michelle Gaida. And then Elena Dahlquist is also joining us as well. So thank you again for having us here. And if we can get started with the slideshow, if y'all are ready with the PowerPoint that was sent over. But just a little bit of background about the National Safety Council. As you mentioned, we are a national nonprofit. You can go to the next slide, please. That was founded over 100 years ago by the business community in the wake of a tragic accident, saying that we can do better to make sure people who come to work every day go home in the same way that they came to work. And so we still work on workplace safety today. We also work to ensure our roads are safe, and also on the issue of impairment. And this one really was brought to our attention as we saw the increase in preventable overdoses over the last 10 to 15 years. So next slide. A lot of what we're here today, obviously, to talk about is something we've been trying to draw attention to, is the safety impacts of legalization of cannabis throughout the U.S. This is a NCSL map showing where cannabis is legal, whether it's medicinal, recreational, both, or it hasn't been addressed yet. But I imagine in the not too distant future, every state will show as having some type of legalization, if not done at the complete federal level. So next slide. I think one of the biggest things that we communicate, we don't take a position on legalization, pro or con. We let legislators, voters make those decisions. But what we really want to drive home is that it is impairing when you use it, and then it can have safety impacts. And so how can we really try to mitigate those safety impacts? Next slide. One of the things that we're trying to figure out today in this discussion, and we'll continue to work on for many years, is what is impairment, though, from cannabis. And as I'm sure you all know, it's very different from alcohol, where presence of THC in your system does not necessarily mean that you're impaired. And so how do you determine when somebody's impaired? And I've got this chart here on the right-hand side of the slide to show on the roads, it may be slightly easier to tell because of how that standard lane deviation, how much further people weave in and out of the lanes that we've probably unfortunately all seen impaired drivers do. But we know that there are some things we can do to help determine that, including training our supervisors to detect impairment, different types of testing, and also discussing both oral fluid and hair testing. So with that, I thought it would be good to turn it over to our friends located in Maryland, the Chesapeake chapter. And I think Dave's going to kick it off here, but you can go to the next slide. I thought you might like to just hear about what's going on in your own state. Dave?
All right. Well, good evening, and I thank you all very much for the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Dave Medeiros. I'm the president of the Chesapeake Region Safety Council. We are a regional chapter of the National Safety Council, and our mission is to educate and influence people to prevent accidental injury and death. I also have Debbie Jennings, who is our traffic services and special projects coordinator at Chesapeake. In 2019, I'm a safety professional, and we do a lot of educating. We're also an OSHA Training Institute education center in the mid-Atlantic area of the country. So a lot of what we focus on is workplace safety and health. And in 2019, an opportunity came up because cannabis had been legalized to use for medical card holders. And we have we work with a lot of people who work in high hazard industries, such as the construction industry. And construction employs roughly around 5% of the workers in the United States, and it's consistently responsible for about 20% of the workplace fatalities. And so one of the things we were concerned about is, how is this going to impact the high hazard businesses and the people that we deal with as far as impairment goes. Debbie Jennings made me aware of a green lab type thing that was happening in Montgomery County with law enforcement officers, and they were using it for driver safety. And part of what we do as well is driver safety. We conduct reasonable suspicion programs, and we have a traffic safety division, of which Debbie Jennings has been the lead on for a number of years now. But we were trying to understand this stuff a little bit more, because we have people in the workplace that are safety directors. We're not law enforcement, but especially since I use construction a lot, and I use it because it's a high hazard industry, and it's a very large industry in the state of Maryland and in the DC area. A lot of our people are construction folks, and we have concerns, because when they engage in the workplace activities they're engaged in, if they have a level of impairment and they're not able to focus on what they're doing, or they have some sort of a visual or coordination impairment associated with something they've done, whether it's fatigue, whether it's a medication, whether it's an illicit drug. It could be a number of things. It could be from mental stress. We have a concern about that. We want to really and truly, if you look at the people we work with, we like to refer to them as construction or industrial athletes, and we want them to be fully focused when they're doing what they're doing each and every day in the workplace. Now, the other part of that is, there's people who have got these medical cards, and they are using cannabis for a medical purpose. And traditional fitness for duty programs in the workplace are, pretty hard-nosed as far as, if you have a certain amount of a metabolite in your system following a urinalysis, then the company policy will kick in and address you accordingly. It's the same thing if you have a commercial driver's license. The federal motor carrier safety regulation requires that, people submit to drug and alcohol screening if they hold a commercial driver's license. And one of the things we've done for years is taught reasonable suspicion courses so that people who are in the chain of supervision for commercial drivers, if they recognize signs and symptoms that look unusual to them and indicate that that's potentially an impaired individual, they're required by the law to take action and send that person for a reasonable suspicion test. It doesn't mean that a normal person, a lay person, is going to say, hey, you are impaired by X, Y, and Z. What they're doing is looking at them and based on signs and symptoms, contemporary, articulable signs and symptoms based on odors, behaviors, speech, smells. I can look at you and say, hey, here's an impairment concern I've got. We also have this concern in the workplace. Once again, we've got people that are engaged in what I'd like to call safety sensitive positions. For example, and in the state of Maryland, crane operators are safety sensitive positions. People who do rigging, hook up loads to cranes, people are signalers are safety sensitive, as well as crane operator trainees. They fall under this safety sensitive title, of which puts them in a category that they need they are subject to drug and alcohol testing. So all of that said, the concern we have is, hey, there's a certain amount of people out there. There's so many electricians, there's so many carpenters, there's so many plumbers. If somebody in that pool has a medical card and they're using cannabis for a reason to help them with their medical condition, you know what? If they're using it, they come to work and they take a drug screen and they come up positive based on a urinalysis, it does not mean that they're impaired. It just means that they have the THC metabolite in their system enough to trip the drug test. So we started in 2019, and we've done 20 of these so far. We don't take any federal money. We do this on our own. We started it, funding it out of our own coffers. And what we are doing is, in conjunction when we're teaching reasonable suspicion courses, law enforcement is in another room training drug recognition experts. Their trainees are being trained. We're doing our reasonable suspicion training. And what we wanted to be able to do is have our safety professionals interact with the law enforcement. But there's another aspect to what we do. We have gotten some volunteer medical card holders who come to our facility, which is over in Woodlawn, Maryland, right over off of Lord Baltimore Drive. We bring them in. We give them transportation. We have an emergency medical technician on staff and all of that kind of stuff. And what happens is they will use cannabis at our facility. And then what we will do is go through and interact with them, learn from them, try to figure out why they're using it, because some people are not necessarily up to speed on why these people are using cannabis. And we have our students that come to our classes, interact with them, learn from them, and then the medical card holders will go, and the law enforcement takes advantage of this opportunity to train their drug recognition experts. And they go through the different types of tests that they have to try to determine what category of substance is impairing the individual and what kind of impairment they have. And we have been learning a lot of stuff. And we are very unique. I think we're the only people in the United States that are doing this with safety people. Most of the places, if they are doing it for law enforcement purposes. Once again, we're not law enforcement. That's not the purpose of what we're doing. Our job is to prevent injuries and save lives. That's why we do what we do. And what we want to do is we recognize impairment is a hazard. Okay. So what degree are people impaired if they're using cannabis? And when is it that they're impaired? Because once again, maybe Friday night, I could use some cannabis, and then Monday morning, I could take a drug test and I could come up positive, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm impaired. Actually, I'm probably not impaired at all. But I have it because the metabolite in cannabis is a fat soluble metabolite, and it'll show up in a urinalysis, your typical urinalysis. So what we are trying to do is learn more about impairment. We're trying to educate our safety people who are workplace safety people who want all the people that come to work for them to go home in the same condition that they came to work in the morning. We're taking advantage of the opportunity when law enforcement is in there training their drug recognition experts. We are kind of drawing from the things that they do, and we're learning from them, and we're trying to understand it. My questions to somebody in the lab when they come in, I will ask them, because we have ladders and fall protection equipment, and I ask questions. I'm trying to learn. I will ask somebody that's a cannabis user, are you afraid to use a ladder? And if they say no, then I'll ask them too. I'll say, okay, so after you're medicating, would you still use a ladder after you do that? And how do you determine whether you would or would not? And those are kinds of things that are important for us as safety professionals to learn, to be able to, appropriately address hazards in the workplace. Once again, we want everybody to go home in the same condition that they came to work in. And understanding impairment, like I said, it can be as a result of many different things. But cannabis is a unique one now because, it used to be pretty cut and dry. All right. Somebody failed a drug test, then the policy of the company kicks in, or you have to adhere to the DOT standard. The DOT standard has not changed at all because it's still a federal standard. But what we do in the state of Maryland, what a lot of contractors do, how they handle it, we've got some of our contractors are just taking cannabis or THC off their panel of drugs in their drug testing. And we want to be able to help them as well to make a good, sound risk management decision how they deal with this. So I think in a nutshell, that's a lot of what we are doing. And we have conducted a number of these classes, and we are trying to develop a lot of impairment recognition program. Well, a solid impairment recognition program for our safety professionals. So I think that's about it for what I have to say this evening.
And Dave, I know you've got some other slides. Dylan, do you want to advance through some of those? And if Dave wants to speak to them, he can. You
can advance a little bit more. Once again, we're getting ready to turn 100 years old next year. Just if you don't know, we started as the Baltimore Safety Council in 1923. We became the Safety Council of Maryland in 1970s. And in 2004, we became the Chesapeake Region Safety Council. This gentleman right here was one of our students, or one of our medical participants, and he had a very rare bone disorder. And he was one of the initial folks we had in who was talking about this and told us about how using cannabis had helped him decrease his use of fentanyl as a pain medication. And so he was an excellent guy we had when we first started this thing. Okay, go ahead. This is our class with law enforcement and the drug recognition expert trainees. Next. This is our impairment training, where we're having safety professionals in a course in another classroom. At the same time, the DREs are being trained. Next. And this is another shot of that class. Next. This is our lab area. And if you see our lab area, this is where we do a lot of our safety training. And We have ladders, fall protection equipment. We do a bunch of other stuff. We do lockout, tagout training, all kinds of stuff in there. This is where we have our medical folks come in, and this is where they use their cannabis in different forms. Next. This is the DRE training, and these are some of the tests that they put the medical card holders through. And at the end, there's an evaluation that's done, and based on the responses that individuals have to what the DRE tests are, and then the conversation that the medical card holders will have, DREs may determine that they're impaired, and then we'll ask how the medical card holders feel. Would they drive? Would they do any kind of hazardous activity? And we're seeing how they line up. Next. Okay, and that's the last one. I think this is just talking about highway fatalities in the state of Maryland. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I think all of you know as legislators that Maryland is a state that's committed to zero fatalities, and you've performed better during the pandemic than a lot of other states with actually decreasing fatalities. This is through October of each year, 2020, 2021, and 2022. But we do know that a lot of the cause of these fatalities are persistent problems such as impaired driving, which is about a third of fatalities on the roads. And that crashes overall are leading cause of death for preventable death for people age 5 to 24. We also know that drivers in their 20s and 30s are involved in about 47% of impaired driving crashes as well. The next slide. I thought it might be helpful just to provide y'all with some links of some studies about cannabis impaired driving and what has been learned from other states of comparing crash rates before and after legalization. So these links go directly to those studies to help inform the work that you're doing here. The next slide is just some policy solutions that the National Safety Council supports for Maryland. Y'all have already taken a big step to try to eliminate impaired driving by improving your ignition interlock law through NOAA's law from a few years ago. Some other things to call out are having a 0.05 BAC. While BAC is related to alcohol, what the data show is that reducing that to 0.05 actually reduces impaired driving across the board. And that's from the National Transportation Safety Board. There's also no per se limit for THC that should be set, and we encourage all states that are considering legalization not to set one because it's not based on science, and it's not necessarily showing impairment. Having improved oral fluid testing, which is really that roadside testing for law enforcement to be able to tell if somebody's impaired, it's appearing like oral fluid testing is really the most effective for showing more recent use of cannabis. Also having better toxicology data, and also for the state of Maryland, testing for THC in your fatal crash victims, which does not happen right now. Vehicle technology, that's not a state-by-state issue, but certainly showing support for passive alcohol detection technology in vehicles at the state level can be alcohol and other impairment detection technology can be helpful. And then just improve the training for the entire legal system. So law enforcement, judges, district attorneys, and everybody really who is involved in that to understand what impaired driving is and the laws around cannabis as those are changed. The next slide shows some work that's been done by the National Safety Council Alcohol and Drug Impairment Division to show the leading drugs found in drug impaired driving cases across the country. As you can see, THC is the top one. And then the next, actually several are linked to the opioid overdose epidemic as well. But we use this document to help labs across the country to use this to guide the testing that they do on drug impaired driving. and create some standards, because right now there are no standards around this. This has been published in a peer review source, and the link is below. So just encourage you to think about how you can improve your overall drug impaired driving testing in the state as well. Next one is, again, some other resources. AAA did a fantastic report on oral fluid testing and how it can be implemented in other states and how it's doing out there. And then also, one of the best laws on the books right now for oral fluid testing is actually from Alabama. And this is a link to that legislation in Alabama that enacted it, and also provided implied consent for oral fluid testing, which we have for a lot of alcohol testing, breathalyzer testing, and then also testing for all substances as well. And then just something on the next slide to remind you of the variety of stakeholders that you have at the state level to ask for assistance. You already know and work with these folks, and they really do care about this issue a lot. Of course, law enforcement, your state highway safety office, your judicial personnel, your public health agencies. We don't often talk about those related to impaired driving and impairment in the workplace, but they certainly have a stake. Your toxicologists in the states, and also victim advocates, certainly have a very strong voice. And with the next slide, I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague, Katie Mueller, to talk about workplaces and impairment in the workplaces. Katie?
Absolutely. Thank you all, members, for having us tonight. I'm Katie Mueller, and I'm a program manager at the National Safety Council. I work on our impairment team and also on the roadway team. I spent the last year and a half really studying cannabis legalization and what companies are doing to kind of mitigate the impacts that's happening in workplaces. So I'm happy to share some of the findings with you all. Next slide, please. So one of the organizations that we work really closely with is the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. And those physicians are your medical review officers in larger companies, those who consult on workplace related issues, whether that be drug testing or workers' compensation claims. And they issued some great guidance recently on for employers to follow. And really the key takeaways for me in this guidance was, really addressing the potential that marijuana has for impairment. When we legalize it in the state, making sure that our constituents are aware of that. Also establishing clear policies from the workplace, and having those accommodation practices that Dave talked about for individuals who are utilizing it as for medical use. And then creating safe workplaces, really to foster, the idea that to get people home at the end of the day, and all the great training that's happening in your state that's being provided by the Chesapeake chapter. The potential for consequences of marijuana use in the workplace includes things like consumption and side effects, but also workers' compensation. And this resource really outlines some suggestions for strategies as states develop policies around the issue. Next slide, please. So this is a report from Quest Diagnostics. They issue a drug testing index each year where they identify, the top drugs that are tested for in drug testing panels. And as Dave mentioned, as we see companies taking cannabis out of their pre-employment tests, we're not seeing a decline in cannabis positivity. So that's leading us to some conclusions that you can read in the Quest DTI if you're interested. It's a great place to get information on the drug testing space. Next slide, please. So substance use in the workplace definitely has business impacts that we want to bring to everyone's attention. The ACOEM guidance that I talked about, they issued a joint task force, and their recommendations really looked at these different issues with substance use. It just really means that once legalization has taken place, that marijuana should be closely monitored for all employees in safety sensitive positions. Dave mentioned that whether or not they're covered by federal regulation, and allowing employers to determine what is safety sensitive, as well as allowing them to prohibit it at their workplace. That was one of the recommendations that came out of here. One of them, a clear policy to guide decisions on how employers are to address this. How do they evaluate for impairment? And the importance of consulting legal teams and policy development and continued review of that policy. States that we have seen legalize marijuana and then have, it's a constantly changing industry, very fast paced. And so we're seeing states that have had the best results really have policies that can change. And then it does have an impact to workers' compensation statutes. And so just being aware of those in your state and engaging with those MROs to determine what is required in your state. But really identifying those clear and distinguishable policies is key. Next slide, please. All right. And so really, Jane talked a little bit about this, but some of the safety impacts, obviously, we're very concerned about drivers, not just those who drive professionally, but everyone who's driving, but also developing policies that for employees who are covered by the federal regs, but also those who are not, and understanding what the impact is when an employee uses off the job, and then how are you going to address that in the workplace. And then employees in safety sensitive positions not be impaired while they're at work, but also really thinking about what's happening in other states near you. I know that you have a lot of action, a lot of cannabis regulation happening in the states surrounding you, and establishing clear policies for employees that use marijuana off the job. Next slide, please. All right, and this is a study that we did at the National Safety Council in 2021. We surveyed 500 employers and 1,000 employees nationwide, and you can find this report at www.nsc.org/cannabis. And really, some of the most interesting findings that we found in our research was 1/3 of employees, this is in states with cannabis legalization and without, reported observing cannabis use and CBD products on the job. So we know there's lots of complication with CBD products. They can have impairing effects as well, but the highest incidence reporting these was in the mining and construction industry. So with 42% of those reported being in safety sensitive positions. So they're reporting seeing cannabis use in the workplace, even in those positions that it's currently prohibited. So this is a great report full of information that has been reported to us from employees and employers, everything from how do employees think that employers are communicating the policies, and are they fair, are they unfair? Those kinds of perceptions are all reflected in the survey. Next slide, please. And then this is just a snippet from the Quest DTI that I mentioned before. And this just shows that the positive drug test results have reached the highest rate since 2001 and was up more than 30% from the all-time low in 2012. So we understand that employers are wrestling with the recruitment and retention challenges that are happening across the country, but also maintaining safe and engaging work environments that foster physical and mental well-being for workers. So I encourage you to take a look at that resource. It's a great resource from Quest. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about those that had removed cannabis from their pre-employment testing, and we're seeing that even though they have removed it from their pre-employment testing, they're still seeing use post-accident. So a lot of great data out of this, and the high cost of accidents can't be understated. I think you'll see that over and over in this report. Next slide, please. And then Dave mentioned this, but here is in writing Maryland's safety sensitive definition. So that is what covers those who are designated as safety sensitive. Next slide, please. So Jane also talked a little bit about this, that National Safety Council, we really support legislation that allows impairment-free workplaces, allows for drug testing, and one where the employer defines what is safety sensitive in their workplace. Policies that include accommodations and increased treatment capacity for workers who need it, and a safety culture that embraces recovery-friendly workplaces. Next slide, please. So all of that to say, drug testing is no longer the single solution. I think you heard that in Dave's presentation as well. But training is really important. Standardized drug testing, for whether it be for urine or for hair, can be misleading when it comes to cannabis, because those tests cannot detect impairment. But we all bear, at the end of the day, responsibility to make sure that our workers have every opportunity to go home at the end of the day. So we really encourage policy that supports employers' ability to do this. And that's it for me. Next slide, you'll see our contact information.
Okay. Don't see more from the presenters, so we'll take questions. If members of the work group have questions, use the electronic raise your hand button there, and we will run through them. I see Chairman Wilson, then we'll go to Delegate Wilkins. Chair Wilson needs to unmute himself.
Apologize. Thank you, Chairman. I guess when my concern rests with the employer. As a plaintiff's attorney, I do know some of the dangers that we're discussing, not being able to predict when somebody was in fact intoxicated, if we allowed them to use a truck, a forklift, things of that nature, negligent entrustment. I guess what I'm concerned with, when I've heard a lot of, is almost creating a protected class of worker, i.e. anybody that uses marijuana shouldn't be fired, shouldn't be tested. And I think if I own a McDonald's and I have a fry-later, which is really hot grease, and because I can't determine when you smoked marijuana last, but I don't want you high smoking marijuana, unless somebody can clarify, shouldn't I have a right to say I'm going to test randomly? Because there's no, unless there's some data that you can provide to me that I can find out that day if that person's high. We can do it with alcohol. Is there something that we can get more of an immediate? I know I can't imagine a blood sample. You guys kept saying, or was it the word oral? Oral testing? Was that saliva?
Exactly.
And how recent does that show as far as saliva?
Yeah.
Should be within the last 3 to 6 hours.
So if there's
Saliva test.
a saliva test can determine if somebody's high on pretty much with specificity.
Pretty close to it, yes, sir.
And what's the usage of this? Because I haven't really heard of it. I haven't even heard police officers using it during their DRE.
And
That's where.
Yep, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, law enforcement is where I've heard of it being used the most right now, but some, I would say some law enforcement officers are looking for state authorization or approval because they want to make sure that the sample that they get will be able to be used. So that's the Alabama law that I've got a link to in the slides, is one that could be used as a model statute for other states that are looking to enact something. So it will clearly say that those samples can be used to show impaired driving.
And that I was going to ask that question second, as far as what we have to determine for impaired driving, because obviously that's a great concern. But go back to the employer, is this something that must be sent to a lab? Is this something that can be purchased? How does that work?
Chairman, I can tell you the way I've seen workplaces use it is that they will use it on a job site. They can buy kits that you can do on-site saliva tests with. Typically, if an employer finds somebody, they do a saliva test with them. They come up hot on the saliva test. Then what they typically do is send them through the standard protocol where they take them to a collection site and do a urinalysis.
So I guess what I'm trying to, the last question on that, because I would imagine some employers just want a drug-free environment. They don't want to have to
You are
jump through
correct.
hoops and say that, well, you know, was it 6 hours ago or 4 days ago? And what I've heard was that basically some of you are trying to move away from that model to allow people to consume on the weekends, basically, and maybe come into work on the weekdays without consumption. Is that what the saliva test would benefit?
It would, yes, I would say yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I would encourage too to talk about not just about cannabis specifically, but just impairment-free workplaces, and think about how alcohol as a legal substance can be consumed on somebody's off time, and we know it can work its way out of somebody's system by the time they're back on the job. It's the same with cannabis. It's just the impairment factor is the hardest thing to figure out.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, for sure, businesses.
It's just putting the burden on the business is, I guess, the issue about that's. We'll cross that bridge later. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Chair, if I may, what I think what you're asking about is what's called recent use testing. Recent use testing is what should be used in addition to supervisor training, articulating those symptoms, signs, also having a recent use test, and having all of that as tools for the employer.
All right, we'll go now to Delegate Wilkins. You're on mute.
We just can't get it together tonight.
No, it's terrible. Oh my goodness. Delegate Wilkins, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to go back to the traffic issues and the discussion around traffic, and really focus on the THC and get into the science a little bit more. I appreciate the recommendation around not having a per se limit around THC, but then I also noticed that there was a recommendation that crashes test for THC, and the crash data, that fatal crashes test for THC, and the crash data provided also were measuring THC. So there was kind of a little bit of a disconnect for that for me. So if you can explain why you would make that initial recommendation, but then it seems like your data really focuses on THC. And I'm just very concerned around the impact when we talk about this recent use, because there are dire consequences for people's lives if we get it wrong around, are they impaired or not impaired? So we really get into that science and what the recommendations are when it comes to measuring if someone is impaired while driving or not.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that first part of your question, and thank you for that. So there's really no science behind setting a per se limit, because as y'all know, presence doesn't mean impairment. So that's why we say don't set a per se limit in statute. The issue about having the toxicology testing is to be able to get a better understanding of what substances people are using and then driving. So THC was the most common one that was found among that list, but then the next several were opioids and benzodiazepines. So just in general, we want to get a better understanding of what impairing substances people are using on the roads. And to do that, we have to have a more robust testing system that we don't really have today. We've got great alcohol impaired driving data, but we really have very little about drug impaired driving, but we know it's a problem.
So just to follow up, you're saying that the best thing we have in terms of judging impairment right now is that THC, which is why the data that you showed is focused on THC, but we don't know that the person was actually impaired.
From THC, and what happens on the roadside is that sometimes if, and this is from NTSB report, if a law enforcement officer has a breathalyzer and gets a 0.08 or above, they may stop testing altogether because they know they've reached a point where somebody is driving illegally. And even though they may suspect that there could be other substances involved, whether that be even over the counter that could be impairing, that's all you get in that record is that alcohol impairment. What we need is really to build a better understanding of drug impaired driving on our roads. And to do that, we need to do better and more robust testing.
Okay. Any other questions from the panelists of the work group? Okay, seeing none, we thank you all very much for speaking with us tonight. And that'll bring us to a conclusion here this evening. Again,
Mr.
oh,
Chair,
I'm sorry.
I did have my hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Vice Chair, Senator Feldman, I beg your pardon.
No, that's okay. I got an article sent to me today I thought was interesting, was in Massachusetts, which on I think one of our recent adopting states is starting on January 1st, a curriculum for new drivers trying to get their licenses, an actual curriculum on the risks of impaired driving related to cannabis. And I don't know if I thought it was a pretty interesting piece. It's the first state in the country to roll that out effective next month. Is that something that you all have been monitoring? I think it's a really interesting idea that when you're getting your driver's ed for your new license, you are required to take a course, or part of the curriculum would include impairment related to cannabis, the risks, the safety concerns. I just put that out there because this was just sent to me today, and I thought it was worth, for our state at least, to take a look at.
There's actually funding in the infrastructure bill that the president signed into law last year to provide state highway safety offices with money to help train drivers about the dangers of cannabis impaired driving. I would recommend not limiting just to cannabis, but also just other dangers of other impairing substances as well. And I think that money is supporting that project in Massachusetts. We do a lot of driver training at the National Safety Council, and we're also going to be developing a course on that topic as well.
Yeah, I mean, it sounded like the curriculum was developed in consultation with AAA, and I think it's and I'm sure the insurance industry would have some interest in being involved in that. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to put that out.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed you. Any other questions? Don't think I missed anyone else. Just making sure. Seeing none, we thank you all again very much for being with us this evening. And that'll conclude our briefing for the evening. As I mentioned, we're going to meet again on Thursday, January 5th at 1 p.m. Notice will be sent to everyone's offices. Make sure that this event, the next event, is added to your calendars, and will be publicized on the Maryland General Assembly website. Again, thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a happy holiday to everyone, and we will see you January 5th. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.